pilot implementation. This is your last chance to leave the plane. Okay, so we are at the point in preparing for using Agile within enterprise applications, where we are going to start running a couple of pilots. And so we wanted to educate the pilot teams, but also give this as an opportunity for the larger team to become a bit more familiar with what Agile is about and what specifically the Agile approach we are going to be using is about. So my goal for today is that you leave this session with understanding the fundamental concepts behind Agile, and more importantly, that you understand what Kanban, which is the specific implementation approach we are going to be using, is about, what that approach includes, and some of the key aspects of it. Okay. So Agile is a group of development methods with the characteristics shown here. So requirements evolve through collaboration. Evolve, that's the important thing. So instead of requiring that when you complete your functional specification, it be deep and complete, we still require a functional specification, but it would be done at a somewhat higher level, and with the understanding that nobody completely understands how they need things to look and actually execute until you kind of get into the implementation. So we do the functional specification, then we start the Agile process. And during that process, the functional teams, the technical teams, the change management teams all work very closely together on a daily basis to do the development, and there's that constant feedback between the technical and the functional teams to make sure that we are producing what we need the solution to be. So, if you will, changes or refinements of the requirements are a good thing. Of course, it does become a time in the development where a significant change to something we did way back here does become very disruptive. But you're much more responsive to change, and so hopefully as we go along, we're developing the product that's needed. Okay? Teams use adaptive planning. There's a bunch of aspects to that, but basically what that means is you work on the items that are the highest priority at the time. So we'll see what that means in a little bit, but we try when we go into the plan, we're cycle we're in right now, getting ready for the second half. You know, we select what we think are the things that have to get done, and that's still true. But as we go through the implementation in an Agile mode, at multiple steps along the way, the leadership team working with the project manager will say, okay, at this point in time, are these things still the most important things to get done? Or has something happened, and now something that was a little lower on the list, or maybe not on the list at all of a sudden comes forward and becomes a priority, and something else that was a priority kind of falls off. Okay. The focus of the team is on delivering what needs to be, delivering value, delivering to the spec per se, which of course is still important, but delivering what actually is needed. And delivering more frequently than we might typically deliver, have a regular delivery cycle, and get things out into production on a regular basis. And interrupt me as you may want as we go along. Okay? Because if you ask me later on, I may not remember what I said. There's something called the Agile Manifesto that was documented, if you will, 2001. And you can see it here, but it says basically individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So no one's saying the things on the left and the right aren't both important, but we emphasize the items on the left. So again, we said customer collaboration over contract negotiation. For our purposes, read that working as a team through the process over, having nailed down, these are the requirements, functional specification at the beginning of development. There are quite a number of different implementation approaches to Agile. All they have to do is satisfy the Agile Manifesto. One of the most common ones that kind of came out first is something called Scrum, where basically teams worked on a project. This is generally project focused and would set fixed time intervals, they're called sprints, and they would decide what they were going to implement in that window, and they would go bang, and they'd work for that defined period of time. Most often 2 weeks, but it could be 4 weeks, 6 weeks. It's just something agreed by the teams. And at the end, hopefully they've got everything done. If they haven't, they have things that are going to roll into the next one, and they repeat. Very, very structured, very controlled, and very project focused. So not really a good fit for our environment where we have so many different things going on at the same time. But there's dozens, at least a dozen, other implementation approaches. The one we're going to adopt is called Kanban, and that's one we'll go into some detail on. Key Agile principles. Again, can't emphasize enough. Satisfy what the customer needs through continuous delivery of function, welcome changing requirements, even late in the process. Make sure we deliver what the customer needs. Now, let me pause here and make sure we understand. Evolving requirements, understanding what we need to deliver, is a key element. That doesn't mean the scope of the project is flexible. We have defined what the problem is fundamentally we're going to solve. What's changing is the specifics of how we're implementing it. If we should get to a point in any given implementation where we say, oops, the whole definition is wrong, that's a kind of a pause, go back to the management team, reassess priorities, decide whether we're going to change that scope. So I don't want to leave the impression that the world is wide open for changing requirements. There's still a defined scope to what we do. It's just not having to specify or really understand, in depth all the nits and noise of how that should best be solved, how the problem should be solved and delivered to the production environment in our case. I already talked about constant collaboration with the business people and give the teams as much independence as possible, make them over time very self-driven, self-motivated, and within bounds, let them get the job done and improve their processes and get increased productivity as a result and increased satisfaction for the workers who are participating. And the last one, the best way to communicate is face-to-face. So there's going to be an emphasis on the team getting together. There will be generally a daily meeting around 15 minutes around something that's called the board, and we'll talk about that, where face-to-face the team is talking about, where we are, any problems, what do we have to address. But during the day, if something becomes a question, you go and talk to the person. Now, if somebody's at AOB, right, we have to modify that a little bit. You pick up the phone, you talk to them, right? But you do that as opposed to try to solve a complex question via exchanges of email. You can use email to deliver already defined things that aren't really open questions that need discussion. Things that need discussion should happen face-to-face or over the phone. So what are the benefits of Agile? These are the 4 areas that are emphasized. Visibility. This means visibility to the customer, right? And this is as compared to our existing development processes, which would be described as essentially the waterfall development process, the process that's been used for years and years and years and years to develop software. So there's much more visibility to the customers to what's going on because the customer has representatives on the team that are working on it every day, and because we deliver more frequently, the customer's seeing what's happening more frequently than, you start now and 3 months later, you think you know what they're delivering because you wrote a spec to the extent you understand it, and then they go off to Never Never Land, come out and test, you begin to understand it, and you go, oh my God, right? So visibility is much better for the customer. Adaptability, well, we talked about that. Adjust the requirements as we see the solution evolve. Business value, that's really dependent upon the ability to deliver operating software into the production environment more frequently. So if it's a project that you're basically doing via an Agile method and you can't deliver into production until the project is done, you'll still have increased visibility, you'll still have increased adaptability, but the business value doesn't have the curve that's shown there because you still don't get that value until you deploy it. But otherwise, to the extent you can make those things that are deliverable into the environment smaller, yes, you get that value more quickly. And the risk curve, right, it's basically, again, a reflection of the fact that you're working tightly together as a very collaborative, cooperative team. And so the risk that we end up producing and delivering something that's not meeting the need is considerably lower. Any questions about that?
Did you get the blank scroll button?
Thank you. There's a couple really dangerous buttons on this. Okay, what are the results using Agile? This is information from a study that was done of projects, some number, I don't know the exact number, from 2002 to 2010. It was done by the Standish Group. And what it basically showed is by using the Agile approach, instead of having around 30% of your projects fail, i.e. deliver nothing to, throw up your hands, throw the code away, and walk away, that percentage goes down to 9%, which is a dramatic improvement. Okay. The number of successful projects goes from, and successful in this case would mean you basically delivered what was intended on approximately the schedule that was intended at or below the cost that was intended, right? Goes from 14% to 42%. That's also a huge improvement. And the challenged projects, and I would say challenged means you got so far, you had some hiccups, you had to really make some major adjustments to requirements, you were probably late, probably over budget, but you delivered, basically in the end, something into the production environment that did what it needed to do. Goes up from 49% to 57%. So that increase is not quite as dramatic. So you still have, the risk of still having a challenged implementation is still around 50%. And I do not know the maturity of the Agile implementation teams that are within here. Okay. I'm presuming that they aren't teams that were doing it for the first time. Because it does take a number of cycles to mature the process and everybody become comfortable with it and get the highest productivity. Any questions on that? So, what's the industry doing? The industry is moving towards Agile. More and more companies are adopting the Agile approach to develop their products, to support their infrastructures, their business applications like Reasonable. And fewer are staying at the pure waterfall level. Okay. So this is where the industry is, in many ways, already gone, and we're now going to start going that way. So let's talk about some of the foundational elements of Agile. There's a couple of key terms that you need to keep an awareness of. One is the work backlog. So one of the things that typically happens is you have this bucket at the front of the process. That is the backlog bucket. And people are throwing work to be done into that bucket all the time, right? Anybody can throw stuff in, basically approved to define requirements, and the bucket can get pretty full. But that's the stack of work waiting to be done sometime, maybe. Okay? The work queue, I'm going to jump to the bottom, is actually the stack of work that made it out of the bucket and is now teed up for the team to implement. Okay. These three, theme, epic, user story, are basically a breakdown of requirements. So we might, in a functional specification, look for you to have defined at least the themes and maybe some epic level items. And then there's still work to be done to break those down into the more specific requirements, which in a project environment, where we're actually developing or totally changing the way we do something, right, would be a user story. That's the terminology that gets used for a specific requirement that can be implemented. Questions on that? And here's just a picture of that breakdown, right? So you have themes. Themes break down into epics, and then epics break down to stories. Now, I talked about the work queue, work that's teed up. Primarily stories should be going into that bucket. Sometimes and Epic will go into that bucket. And we'll look at it when we're getting ready to go and realize we really need to break it down to a few more stories before we proceed. So that can happen. But the goal was primarily to put stories into that bucket, certainly not a theme. Before it gets put into the work queue, even if it went into the backlog as a theme, the analysis has to have been done to break it down to hopefully the story level. So here's the Agile framework for Kanban, which is the particular method we're using. And basically, one of the things about Kanban, and the primary reason we will be adopting Kanban, is that it is not, unlike, for example, Scrum, limited to focusing on implementing a given project. It is amenable to accepting multiple classes of work into the environment. So for us, we still would have some projects where requirements get to the high-level design as themes, epics, as we talked about, and then we get down here to stories and epics, and that gets into the backlog and ultimately into the work queue. But we also have bugs, which we're actually going to marry with this. Bugs meaning defects in what you're working on before it goes to production, as opposed to defects, which are all those things that come in remedies because it's in production and it gets found by a customer or by one of the functional folks and gets reported and has to be fixed, but it's already being experienced in production. And another item that really should be here would be another box that says maintenance. Right? We have certain things that you guys do on a regular basis that you could view as maintenance. In a way, bundles are maintenance, tax updates are maintenance, those sorts of things. So this is sort of, if you will, front-end work. And prioritization happens when we're ready to refill this work queue because stuff's been done. So every couple of weeks, the prioritization team, which we'll talk about, will get together and look through the backlog and say what's most important now. Now, hopefully, if we're in the middle of a project, one of the things that's most important is that step in the project because you want to get it done. But things may have come up that are more important, and you make the decision then as to what should go in the queue. And the idea is to avoid the very obscure debates up front about what's more important than something else when you get to an actual point in time where you're ready to move something else into the development cycle. It's much more clear to the senior team that, yeah, I want my requirement, but it really is true that the procurement team or the benefits team or something needs that more urgently than I need what I want. It's much easier to make that decision in the moment when you're actually putting something into the work cycle. Then it goes into, this is the actual Agile cycle stuff in the box. So based in a lot more detail, but this is the actual Kanban team doing its work. And with the exception of this, operations reviews, which are sort of a periodic, let's look at from a higher level how we're doing. Okay. And then things get done, this is sort of the cycle, and they go into this queue, if you will, up here, things that are release ready. And if it's a project, it may mean there's a bunch of stuff that has been individually developed and unit tested and tested functionally as it stands, but it was only part of a bigger thing. And so when we're ready to deploy it, we still have to do the integration test And that would happen up here before it actually gets released into the production environment. But there should be a lot of things that are standalone. If there's a defect that came in, hopefully that gets addressed as a single item. It comes out the end, and it can go into production on whatever is agreed to be the cycle for release of those types of items. Right now we're doing a weekly cycle, right? So there's really two primary teams. One is what I'm calling here the Agile Senior Team. So they're the ones who feed the backlog. They're the ones who triage the backlog. I didn't talk about that. Periodically, every couple months, maybe, that senior team goes through that big bucket of items and makes a very simple decision on each one. Do we still need to do it? Or is it overcome by events? Yes, no. Does it stay or does it go? And that's called triaging the backlog. The idea being, the reality is as time goes on, sometimes things get overcome by events, or somebody determines that it really should be done in a different project, and that there's something else in the bucket that's more current. And you get rid of the ones that you don't need to be continuing to look at and prioritize. So that's what triage means. And they do that just-in-time prioritization of the work. That's the thing I just talked about, right? What's ready to go into the work queue for the team now? It's functional managers and executives, the technical managers, the project managers. If there is a product being developed, if you will, or in our cases, a major implementation, the person who owns that from the business standpoint is also involved. Okay? Then there's the implementation team. And what you see is basically, it's all customer-centric. Oftentimes, but not all the time, the customer would be represented by one of our business analysts on the HR side or finance side or campus. Right? But there may be something that needs to be done that our analysts really haven't been around much, in which case the person doing the analyst sort of role is actually a customer person. And there still may be a BA working with them. Right? So there may be literally a customer person who knows what the problem is, knows that area of the business better than any of the folks within our greater EA team and Connect Carolina team. And so they're engaged. But there's project manager, tech writers, testing, which also is the same person as the BA, right? Multiple hats, and the development team. So this is talking about getting ready for the cycle, and we've really talked about this, right? If it's a project, these steps still have to happen. But we get to this high-level design, and we're talking more about themes and epics than we are detailed requirements. So that means that to some extent, our expectation about the functional specification is going to have to be adjusted when we're doing something and using the Agile approach. So you still will go to the ARB, DRB, hasn't changed, right? And then this step, working out the rest of the epics and the stories, is new in the sense that it's being done now kind of within the team and not expected to be completed necessarily, up front.
What is the current thinking with pilots that are being developed, whether they're going to be project work or whether it's going to be stuff out of the...
Our current approach is going to be to take an area of work, procurement, and put all of the work, or most, not still define exactly the full scope, but the goal is essentially all the work that's procurement related on the finance side would go through that Agile pilot team. So we would be doing it kind of as we're describing it here, not limiting it to a project, because we're not really testing the methodology we want to use if we keep it that focused. Any questions on that? User story. What is a user story? A specific customer requirement. If you're in the business of delivering products into the marketplace, it's a market requirement, which results from a breakdown from the high-level design. We talked about that. And it is written from the user's point of view. So it's three parts. Who, that's the end user. What do they need? That's the goal of what we're going to deliver. And why do they need it? What's the benefit that's going to be recognized as a result of implementing that requirement? So in a really simple example, as the instructor, that would be me, who, right, I want team members, that's to learn the Agile principles. That's what I want to accomplish today, right? So that they can appreciate the underlying concepts and be ready to support implementation. That's why. Who, what, why. Now, we all know there's like the five, right? Who, what, why, when. Who, what, why in a story. At a level that is specific enough to be implemented, testable. It's not a requirement or story if you can't test it. And it should be small enough that you can achieve it within a reasonably small piece of time. If it's too big, you ought to try to break it down into a couple more so that they can get cranked through in I'll say a couple of few weeks. So user stories, and again, that term is primarily sort of a major project oriented, but it also applies to defects and maintenance sorts of things. Right? The term is invest. Right? They're independent. You can implement it standalone. It's negotiable, i.e., as we're going through, we can adjust the requirements as we need to. It's valuable. The why better be pretty compelling, given our limited resource. But estimable, we don't do a lot of estimating or spend a lot of time estimating in Agile. But you still have to be able to decide, is it bigger than a bread box or is it bread box size, right? So you have to be able to have a rough idea of how much work it is. It should be fairly small, especially if you were doing the Scrum method, because then you got 2 weeks to do it, right? And it has to be testable. Like I said before, if you can't test it, it's not a requirement. So I said we don't spend a lot of time doing estimation, but we do estimation. And it's done as a group estimate, a group exercise. It's best to get some level of estimate of the things that are in the backlog. If they are bigger than stories, which many of them will be in the backlog, it's going to be a more gross estimate, right? But it's still trying to get a rough idea of where it is. When you actually get down to a story, which may not get estimated until you're re-looking at your work queue, okay, and the implementation team itself is doing it, then it's going to be more urgent that you come to agreement. But the idea is it's rapid process. And what I mean here, one pass on several stories using typical estimation techniques, that's a startup. That's a priming the pump statement. We're getting going. We're doing our first passes, our pilots, and we have ways we've used to do estimates. So the first time we do estimates and stuff, we'll probably apply, our rough estimate approach that we use today, which actually is fairly rapid right now, to get estimates. But then from then on, you don't do it that way. You do it using relative estimation based on the size and the complexity. Because those two together really give you a better idea of how much work it is, right? If you add the development work, the testing work, and the estimation is an estimation of the whole work that is within the Kanban team, okay? And so everybody on the team gives their best estimate of all the work. So if you're the BA, you're not just saying it's this much analysis work. You, over time, have to gain an appreciation for what things take and have an appreciation for what it might mean to development based on growing experience. So all estimation is of the full scope of work to be implemented within the Kanban team, okay? And there's this thing called story points. It's the measure. This thing has 10 story points, we think. It's just the relative estimate, right? You get an appreciation for what, one story point is like 10 story point. You get a feel for it. As time goes on, you get better and better at it. And that's what you use to estimate how much work is involved. And we'll almost certainly use that same method for the other types of work that come into the system. Okay. So, story point estimation. There's a thing called the card system. So, everybody on the team has a deck of cards. I just ordered them, by the way. And they are numbered from 1 to n, but not sequentially. They're numbered in what's called a Fibonacci sequence, which is the next number is the sum of the two prior numbers, right? So 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, on down the line, okay? The reason for that being is the higher that number gets, the less sure you really are how big it is. So why have 99 and 100? It doesn't make any sense, right? So a larger number of story points, the more gross the number is that you use, right? So whoever wrote the story describes it to the team. And, so Ann's on the team, Greg's on the team, and Corey's on the team, and they're sitting there, and Corey's the author. She goes, this is the story. And you tell the story, what's important about it, spend just, maybe a minute or two describing it. Now, everybody else around the table thinks about it, picks a card, And they all throw them down together. And Corey put down a 1, and you put down a 10, and Greg put down 100. And there's probably a couple other numbers in there because there are more people in it, right? And you go, wow. We have wildly different views of what this is. And let's pretend that, in fact, there were 5 numbers. And so we had the 1, we had the 100, we had the 10, and an 8. Actually, it wouldn't be 8, 13. So there was a 13 and an 8, so they're pretty close. And another 13. But we still had these 2 big outliers. So then the people who have the outliers talk about why they think. Why does Corey think it's a 1? And, why does the person with the 100 think it's 100? The person who wrote the story, tries to give more context. You talk about it for another couple minutes. You go back, pick your cards up, go again. And the idea is within a couple of those cycles, you should see coalescing around an agreed approximate number, right? So you should have mostly, say, 8s and 13s, right? And you pick a number and go forward. Don't waste any more time on it, right? If after you've done that and spent 5 minutes on it, the 10 minutes on it, you haven't reached agreement, stop, set it aside, go on to the next one. Because oftentimes, right, as you go down, things are cranking in the back of your mind. When you come back to it later, you'll more quickly come to an agreed view of it. And so that's what's done for each story. And then the story points get assigned and recorded. So that's how big we think it is. And the reason it's important is we determine how much work the team could have based on the aggregate number of story points. And we end up saying there shouldn't be more than, I'm making this up, 200 story points in the queue at any one time, or in process at any one time. Right? And you stick to that within very close margins until at which point somebody decides that 200 is too high and it really should be 125. So, it will change over time, but that's a key aspect of all this. So again, it's relative estimation. Compare, this is like that. Compare to stories you've already done, and don't spend too much time on a story. So, some best practices for Agile teams overall. First off is establish some team rules. Come together physically whenever possible. And for the most part, we can pretty much do that in this building, with the exception of when we have some people who are, based and stay at AOB doing part of the day their other jobs. But we'll find ways to work around that using Skype or whatever, cameras. Inspect and adapt. That's basically right. The plan you do it, you adjust. Define done. Why is that important, Anne?
So you can stop, move on to the next backlog item that was prioritized by your triage team.
And that everybody has the same view of what done is. Okay, so we have stuff coming in. When is done for the Kanban team? Is it when it's been, each item has been functionally, had function test at that unit level and passed? Is it when that's true and the change management team has completed its work and its product has been tested? What is it? When are you done and can take it out of the tile that's in process and move it up to the ready to release stack. Okay? Establish rules of order. Again, use email appropriately. We talked about that. And very good communications within the team. You know, you got to use the rules that say if there is no characterization, positive, negative, about what somebody says, everything that everybody says has value, even if it's that it indicates that that person, we need to explain to that person again what it is we're doing, so eventually everybody's on the same page. And the introverts on the team need to be drawn out because the introverts have important things to say. They just don't like to say them. So we need them to do it.
They just need time to put their thoughts together. It's like,
That too, right? But everybody needs to be participating. Okay, enough about general principles. Let's talk about Kanban itself. So one of the goals of the fellow who basically developed the Kanban and evolved the Kanban process over a number of years was to minimize the disruption to an environment where he's introducing this method. The Scrum approach that I alluded to earlier is pretty darn disruptive to the whole environment. You're totally basically changing the way work is done all at once. Boom. And that's hard for any given culture to adapt. Okay. So the idea is that you take your basic existing development process and put it into the Kanban model with minimum disruption. You have to still negotiate with your stakeholders on the input side and on the output side about, we're taking this new method and it's going to mean some things are going to look different to you on the output side, and how far we take things on the input side is going to be a little different. And oh, by the way, you're not going to get, well, we guarantee this is going to be done in 3 weeks, with a couple of exceptions. But you're going to see more frequent delivery, and you're going to gain confidence in this team's delivering value to you at a fairly good pace. Okay. But within that basic process, you're still going to do requirements, right? You're going to break them down. You're still going to do development, although in a much more collaborative, frequently talking mode. You're still going to test what's there. And again, with the tester still working closely with the developer, right? And you're going to have to do, if it's part of the requirement, change management work. So all that stuff is still there. It's just a little bit different and a lot more collaborative. So that's one of the key characteristics. Scrum, as I described it to you, said there's 2 week, 3, 4 week, whatever they decide, cycles, and stuff comes out the end every 2 weeks. Kanban is a continuous delivery model. There isn't any 2 week, 3 week, 4 week sprint. So it's not iteration driven. Work is pulled into the process by the team, not pushed. So the important thing about that is, I'm going to jump to the bottom. We limit the work in process. So up front, we make a decision, which is basically initially a kind of a gut decision based on experience, as to how much work should be in process within the team, not what's in the work queue, but actually in process within the team at any given time. And they might say 2 stories per person, 3 stories per person, or you might say, a total of X story points. You set some work in process limit. And you do your damnedest not to violate that. And why? Because it limits some things that are counterproductive. The idea is limit how many things you're working on at one time. Don't be trying to multiplex across 5 items at once. It's totally inefficient, right? You go from one item to the next, it takes you 20 minutes, a half an hour to get your head back where you were last time you were working on it. So you should have 2 or 3 items maybe that you're working on at the same time, ultimately working down to 1 or 2 when the team gets very efficient. Okay. And it ultimately improves the overall productivity. It gets rid of that inefficiency associated with the multiplexing. And to some extent, it should create a little bit of slack time for people to think about how can we improve what we're doing. Going back up, supports multiple sources and types of work items. So yes, you can have projects, you can have defects, you can have maintenance work, and something else if there's another type. And you can classify those work items. So we'll spend a little more time looking at that, but basically you can say, if I've got this much capacity in the team all at once, I roughly want to allocate 30% or 40% of that capacity to project work. 50% to supporting production, and 10% to maintenance activities. I just made that up, right? You can make those kinds of, and you can also put different priorities as the service level objectives, or service level agreements, but really service level objectives on the different types of work. Now, there's one exception to all this, and that's the ad hoc expedite work items. Greg, what do you suppose is our ad hoc expedite work item?
Well, usually it's something that we have a problem with that needs to be fixed right now kind of thing.
Yeah, so what do we call that? Critical ticket. That's our ad hoc expedite work item. If one of those comes up, it's number 1 for the whole team. It doesn't get counted in the work in process. It is all hands on deck till that one's done and out the door. And then you go back. Okay. Hopefully, when that happens, one at a time. But never know. So again, for Kanban success, focus on quality, reduce the work in process, that's the work in process limit, deliver often, balance demand against throughput. So that's the work in process limit, prioritize, and that's prioritize at the right time, right? When you're feeding work into the team, prioritize at the basically real time based on what's the status of the business at that time. And over time, look at the process and try to improve it based on what you're observing as it goes on. So quality isn't anything that was talked about in the Agile Manifesto. So why is that in here? And the reason is that second bullet. Many teams spend as much as 90% of their capacity fixing defects in the field. Think about 6 months after we went live, right? We were in that world, right? So the focus on quality is so that you're not doing it, that you actually can be spending time on the other things that you want to be able to accomplish. Okay. So there's a number of techniques that are listed here that can be used. We should, as a team, decide which ones we're going to adopt. And do our very best to make sure that we're putting out as error-free product, if you will, into the field as possible. And if you were in a business like IBM, where I was for 27 years, it's even more expensive when that defect comes in from the field. It is so much less expensive to fix it in-house before you ship it. If it goes out in the field, there can be a lot of disruption, there can be a lot of scurrying to put out quick patches, and that's very expensive. Multiple times more expensive than fixing it before you ship it. I don't think Microsoft has figured that out yet. Constraining width. Here's an example, and by the way, this is one experienced by the developer of the process. So it's his real experience during his evolution of the Kanban process. There's this business unit at Microsoft called the XIT business unit. I don't know if he made that up for purposes of anonymity. It was based in India. It was the worst performing team at Microsoft. It had a typical lead time to get something in its work stack done of 125 to 155 days. So he's more of a consultant type, right? He got hired to go in and see if you can fix this problem for us, right? So he adopted an agile approach with constrained working process. Notice he doesn't say Kanban because he's still on the way to getting to what he calls Kanban. They reduced the cycle time to 25 days over 15 months. And they became the best performing team and won engineering excellence awards. It can work. It also encourages a culture of done, right? Define what done is. You know what done is. Stick to it. And it reduces ambiguity, and it gives you the satisfaction as a team member of saying, damn it, we got that done today. We got 5 things in the done column, as opposed to oftentimes we come to the end of the day and we go, did we really get anything done today? Well, you know, because you've defined what done is, and you've literally moved work into the done column. Limits the inefficiency of too much multitasking. Reduces the team stress. Anybody feel stressed ever? Of course not. And ultimately, it does yield to increased productivity. Yeah. So here's the big question. What is the right work in process constraint? Experience has shown that the best productivity is ultimately achieved when you have 1 or 2 items per person on the team. But you can't start there. You have to start with a higher number. The reason being, you're just getting started. There's going to be fits and starts during the process, and what you don't want is while there's some problem being resolved and smoothed out, somebody sitting there twiddling their thumbs because they don't have anything in it. So you start out with a higher working process, and then as the team evolves and gets more a smoother operation, you gradually lower it till you get to what you feel is the highest efficiency, highest productivity working process. I told you there'd be a wall, a card wall, and it models the development process and is what you can physically see to help tell you what's going on within the team now. So here's a wall. And this is, I think, basically the wall we'll be using, right? So there's the work input queue. That's not counted in the working process. But on the other hand, when the senior team is prioritizing something to put into the input queue, they should be cognizant of what the work in process limit is and what the productivity of the team is, and based on how often they're doing the prioritization, do an appropriate level of fill so that, the numbers in that queue do get kind of down, not to zero, when they refill it, okay? Because it's kind of demotivating. If you've always got an input queue that looks like 100 items, right? That's not good. Whereas if you've got a work queue that's got, I'll make this up again, 10 items, and you're seeing it go down, 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 but every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it is, they're going to come back and they're probably going to fill it back up to there's 10 again. That's a lot more comfortable feeling than, oh my God, look at all this work. So that's the input queue. Normally, our first step is for some level of analysis, right? We have epics in there. The stories need to be broken down to a lower level of detail. We need to do the estimation within the team, right? Do the sizing poker. But it could be that it's already well enough defined and we got it done and it doesn't have to go to analysis and go straight to development. But most usually it'll go to analysis, and when the analysts, people are done with it and think it's ready, it goes into a ready for development queue or buffer, if you will. And when the development team, which may be 1 or 2 people, right, are ready for more work, they'll pick something from that buffer and start working on it. When they're done with the development and the unit test, and so they think it's ready for functional testing of that element, they put it in ready for test, and that is typically when change management has enough information to do their work, right? So you may also put it into what would be a change management queue, ready for change management. And again, the people working in change management will pick it up when they can and do their work. And we test it, and we go back and forth until it's what we think it's supposed to be. And then it gets release ready. And when perhaps both of these are release ready, it's done, right? It goes up to that queue of things ready for release. And they aren't necessarily really ready for release. They may be ready for integration test, depending upon, what it is you do. Questions about this? Because this is what you will be looking at every day for about 15 minutes. In the actual team members are the ones who go up and take work and move it from one to the next. It's not some project manager saying it's ready. It's the team member says, I'm done, and he moves it. Or she moves it. So there's cards, story cards. And the story cards have the story on it, have the sizing on it, the story point allocation, have, if there's a prioritization that we're doing across classes, has that on it, has the classification on it, has a bunch of things on the front and the back of it, okay? And so these are those story cards. So you could have one that's sort of looking like this. There's a few things in analysis, development. There's something waiting to go into test or something in test. That's kind of early on. More quickly, well, to illustrate, when you start seeing this, and it may be more than 3, right? Backlogs. One of the big goals of having this board is that it is a diagnostic tool. And when you see large stacks in a queue. Why? What can we do to fix that? Why did it happen? Did we have a change, have a new team member in the development and they're still coming up to speed? Or maybe they're more junior and so they're somewhat less productive than the prior person was? So maybe we need to do a readjustment of our WIP limit. Why? And what do we do to fix it? Another thing is something can get blocked. And we do something on a card, we haven't decided what yet, but we will shortly, to flag it as blocked. And blocked just means for whatever reason, the person working that card can't go forward. There's information they need, there's technology that somebody else is getting ready that's not ready yet and they need it. It can be almost anything. They got so far and they realized they need further clarification on the requirement, so it needs to go back a little bit and have some analysis done. There's any number of reasons why it might get blocked. But again, when you see one blocked and you have your daily meeting, if you can solve it right then in 15 minutes and get it unblocked, great. If not, you take that person and whoever else you need to an after meeting and talk about it and figure out what has to be done to get it moving again.
Before you go on, can I ask a question? I'm a kind of show me person and thinking about our current environments. So if something is ready to test versus test, is that a matter of somebody hasn't then picked up the card and moved it?
Yes.
And we typically have multiple test environments. How do we reflect that in testing?
That's a very good question, and we haven't actually addressed that specifically. But before it would move here, depending upon what it is, it certainly would have had to gone through TST.
I'm assuming when you say test, I'm thinking TST.
Right.
So now that's.
But if it's one of those elements that actually, once it's release ready, can just go, it's also going to have to go through SPT
So I don't
within test.
So maybe it's a mind shift that we have to make. I have always used TST as more of a unit level testing, and then when we get to SPT, it's truly the full blown testing. So that does this model support that, or do I need to?
Yeah, I think the terminology I would use would be a little different, but I get what you mean.
So I think there are other groups that use TST for fully integrated testing and then do like SBT for the customer UAT, even if it's an internal customer. But I don't think that matters if you're doing a different variety. I think this column is really just saying we're testing.
Functional
And
people.
when you cross over from testing to release ready, it's been signed off. The environment should not matter. We're saying at that point it's ready to be implemented. You may hold it because it's a piece of a bigger piece. Let's say you had 2 stories for learning at phase 2. Okay, more than 2, right? So let's say we get the first one, the second one, third one, fourth one signed off. We're all happy. But we really can't put it in until we get the 5th one. We would put those 4 in release ready, and another one stays in development or test. And it could be an SPT, it could be a TST. I don't think this is meant to be an environment. When you say dev, is we're really saying ready for development, right? Or really ready for configuration, initial game configuration really would fit there too.
Right. Development can include necessary configuration, right?
So I think in this context, I mean, we'll have to learn as we go, though. I think test really is environment indifferent.
So I think the challenge there is that that's going to feel like a big backlog because you may be in multiple environments with different things. So all of a sudden, I mean, I'm already seeing that backlog situation, what appears to look like.
And that's why we would have to look at that and go, well, how do we fix that? So, and there are going to be situations where release ready and done with test means you've been through SPT, and why? Because it's a standalone piece that can go. Many times, you're just going to be pieces of a bigger piece. You'll test it in TST, do your functional testing. It'll go to release ready and out. And when all the pieces are there, the SPT level integration testing, full testing, will happen, but outside of this process.
So just to, sorry, to ask one more question there. So customers are signing off at the release ready state, even though it's only a piece of the whole?
It says they're signing off on that particular piece. It doesn't say they're signing off on the integrated whole until the integrated whole is there. Okay. So when you move something from TST and say it's ready for SPT, you're basically saying my functional testing of this unit, right, is done. And I'm signing off on it, or you wouldn't say it can go into SPT.
But the
Same basic
customer
thing.
being the, I'm playing the analyst role versus the customer. I don't know that it's because it's only a part of a whole, they may not be ready to sign off because they need to see it. We might not even want to show it in parts.
Well, remember the customer's integrated into the team. So the customer's mindset has to, they're at that interface, adjusted to how we're going to operate. Now, how formal we are about it, that test exit, if it's a piece of a bigger thing, may be a little bit different if we know it's a piece of a bigger thing. And we may just say, if there is a customer person actually on the team, that they're going to be okay with you making that judgment, and they're going to make their judgment when the integration test happens before it goes. Those are things with details, important details, that we'll have to agree on.
And at the point of release ready, we've moved on. Or we're done in this scenario, but now you go to UAT testing, the customer says, no, you misunderstood. Does it come back? Or do you start a new story? What's the...
I guess it would depend. And SPT, okay, and again, I think as Don said, people view things in different ways. I view SPT as integration test. It's just when all the pieces are coming together and are being tested by both the team, and if you're going to have a UAT, that also happens in SPT.
And that's
But there's
before you
sequential.
are release ready.
If it's a standalone piece. If it's not, it goes up here. And in this process here, the integration testing would happen. It's outside of the Kanban process. It may involve some of the same people. We aren't able to totally, assign people 100% of their time at this point to Agile, right? Because there's always going to be things like that are happening outside the Kanban team because they're bigger than the level of work that's done by the Kanban team. But if it's a standalone thing, like a defect, then yes, that all would happen in here. And when we send it up here, they can ship it whenever they think it's the right time.
But when you're up in that UAT and the customer either finds a new defect or whatever, does it
Comes back to get worked.
until you come back and start?
Come back.
Does it go back into the triaging, or does it you just?
No, they wouldn't go back there. They'd probably go right back into the work queue to be picked up and addressed as soon as possible.
So it isn't really done until.
Well, the team thought it was done. But there's
I know.
always the possibility
Yes,
that the
yeah,
team
yes,
thought it was
I-
done and they missed something,
I
right?
haven't figured out what the definition of done is. Yes, so.
Well,
Done
that's-
is when it's.
Right. There's done and then there's
It's
done right.
and it's working right, that's when done is.
For the teams, are they kind of structured and then you stick with your team from now sort of until forever and you just keep getting stories? Or if I'm working on an input port testing and if I'm doing this, or am I on separate teams or how does that work?
You want to talk to that, Don? Because that's kind of more of how we're going to go forward.
Sorry, I did not catch that.
What she was asking is, so when she's assigned to a team, I'll answer part of it. Ideally, a team stays together because you get to know each other very well and it makes you more efficient. But like I alluded to earlier, we aren't going to be able to allocate 100% of anybody's day, probably, to a Agile team.
Right.
So it is possible that you might also be working in another Agile team when it's more broadly there
It's not possible,
on something
it's
else.
extremely likely. So I'll pick on my technical team. So Kim Crispin, if there's a team that does data mart work, one of those teams would, right? Whether it's an HR team or a subset of that, she'd be on that team at some percentage of her time. She's certainly going to be, if it's not a team, it's a thing, she's going to be on 9-2 on some percentage of her time, and there might even be a third one. We don't want to parse it too small, but I think we were thinking of trying to go 25, 50, 75, 100 type thing, just to keep it rational. If it's more than that, I think we're getting a little bit crazy. But initially, until we get things going, it could be some of you are on a pilot team and some of you aren't even on any team. You're just doing your day job. Right? I don't know if that makes any sense. So I fully expect we'll have, on the technical side, people will be on multiple teams. We're just going to try to make sure it doesn't add up to more than 1% of the week, right? It's a challenge.
Is that okay?
I guess I'm picturing Agile as you meet with your stand-up team in the morning, you have your 10-minute meeting or whatever, but if you're on multiple teams, I guess you kind of.
Yeah, they have to stagger
Well,
those
yeah.
times, and right.
Exactly. So that
Exactly.
won't be great. So over time, maybe what we can do and get better at this is say maybe we can have less teams with more scope, right, to drive some of the administration down. But I think Bob and I were thinking until we get into the process, we're better off probably trying to keep it small. So if we have any issues or things we tinker with, we don't do it to everyone at once, right? We need to learn a little bit before we go. So on finance side, we're doing a procurement one, and I'm sure it won't be perfect. And then before I try to do it with my grants team and other team, we'll see how that one goes, and then maybe towards the latter part of this year, we'll start to go full blown with other groups.
The end goal
Then we'll
is,
have crossover, right?
the end goal is everyone, or not everyone, but you will be assigned to one team. By the end.
If we're able to get it to the point where you are, say, focused in one particular business area, and we've matured enough in Agile that we are ready to say, like we're doing with the pilot for procurement, all procurement work goes through this team. If we're able to parse that cleanly, and there's always, our teams overall teams aren't big enough to perfectly do that, then we could get to the point where by far the majority of your work is working on a given team. But we're a ways from that.
That best practice to have teams split up by area, or is it better to have, some LM changes go through this team, some there, so that there's more people, or is it better to get really specialized? Does this,
To be resolved in many ways, if you have a team that has BAs and technical folks who, for the most part, are focused in a given area, it's good to operate that way. But that may be in conflict with management strategies that say we want cross-training across teams. And so that's something that has to be balanced because could be some conflicting priorities there that require some balancing. So the stand-up meeting, 15 minutes around the card wall, same time every day. If there's multiple teams you're on, not the same time, but the same time for each team. The focus is on addressing these kinds of things. If you can do it in the meeting, you do it. If you can't, you have an after meeting with the involved people. You try to resolve it. If you can't, in an after meeting, you assign an issue and you track it. Figure out who has to solve it. Maybe the project manager, maybe somebody outside the team. Let you assign it, track it until it's closed, and then move on. The deliver often piece, unlike Scrum, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is what we talked about, right? We'll put stuff up into the release, ready for release cycle, right? And we've talked a little bit about what deliver often will mean. And one of the ideas was, for defects and things like that, maybe the delivery cycle is a week, like it is now. But then maybe there's for some larger work, project work or something, maybe there's one quarter, one every 2 months or something. And then there'll be some stuff that's strategic long-term work that maybe is a half-year cycle. Like every 6 months, there's a big release of a set of things that have been defined. That's an idea. But that's the sort of thing that will have to be worked out. Does that make sense? One of the things that, and we don't really think about this very often, but releasing stuff costs. There's expense associated with it, right? People get diverted to rolling stuff into the environment, validating it in the environment. The I&O team involved doing, extra work in the evenings. I mean, it's their normal work, but they're doing it maybe more often than they might have to. There's increased risk when you're doing it multiple times and something gets screwed up. And, you end up with a problem environment that has to be resolved. So those sorts of things ought to be considered when you decide what your release cycle is like. And you should be thinking about all of those things, right? How big is the test team? All those things. I already talked about this, backlog triage, so we don't need to talk about that. I talked about this. And emphasize again at the bottom line, it achieves on-demand prioritization. So you avoid these lengthy philosophic debates over which project is more important than some other. Attacking sources of variability, and that's kind of back to the wall, right? You start seeing things and picking up on what's causing us to have some fits and starts, and do some work to say we should modify our process by doing this, and it's a team effort, right? Get together and talk about how things are going, what might we want to do differently to improve our operation. There would be some regularly scheduled kind of operations reviews. That's more senior folks, right? Where you're presenting some metrics, where they're getting us a bigger, broader view of how we're doing overall. And that's, again, one of the things that we do. We have work item types. Talked about this, user stories and bugs associated with basically user stories, right? So they're really kind of together. Production problems, critical tickets, maintenance. We don't spend a lot of time on estimation. We talked about that. Sizing poker. But when we're getting down, sometimes when we estimate up front for like 6 months, we have this whole range, very small to very large or huge, right? When we're doing the sizing poker, those can't be there. They're too big. So everything should be, when you're down at the story level, either very small or small, to draw a parallel.
So are you saying, before you said we were estimating for all teams, so you're saying we can't estimate anything larger than 40 hours for all members of the team?
40 hours a week total for that piece of work.
Including development, BA time, change management time.
Yeah. Now, okay, maybe you'll leak into medium,
Okay.
but you don't want 80 hours.
I'm just thinking that if I've got 5 people on the team, that means I'm estimating no more than 1 day each.
No, it depends. I'm talking about an individual story. There may be 10 or 12 stories
Okay.
in the work in
Maybe
process.
that's where I'm.
So it's one story card.
Okay.
Yeah.
But still, it could add up. A certain requirement could be,
It's just
10
40
to
hours
20
across
technical
multiple
hours.
people is a fairly small
It
area.
is. I think that you're setting that as a guideline, because you want to have these pretty small pieces of work, discrete enough to take forward, but small. So,
We may find, I don't think certainly will very large numbers are. The one that was might have been the medium, whether or not. I guess
think
can
we
you tell
consider
over time?
these, that's kind of the guideline to target. We do something that, it's actually big enough, it's probably 20 hours of development work and 30 hours of functional work. It's not the end of the world, it's still scopable. You just don't want something big old thing hanging out there that's something not going to work, that's just too broad.
I mean, if it's that big, it should have been broken down. Some multiple things that are small. Right?
Yeah,
But I think the key is we have to be really flexible from a PM standpoint and from everyone on the team standpoint, of just adapting this as we go.
So we can allocate the work. So in this case, I said, basically 30% stories, 5% bugs. That basically says 35% project work, 50% production problems, 15% maintenance. An example, not necessarily what it would be. Right?
Do you envision actually designing, if that were the model you adapted, that you would divide that up on the board? And try to
Yes.
make sure that you.
Yes, you would try to have those swim lanes on, and so you have the cards associated with those swim lanes. So then you can get into things like class of service, and some of these things, right? You won't try to tackle right away because you got to kind of work your way up to an increasing level of sophistication of what you're doing. But not all work items are equal. And so obviously we've already said critical ticket is its own super priority. But think about project work that has a legislative specified due date.
That never happens.
That's got a different level of priority. It's something we really, really want to get done, but if it's the end of November instead of the end of October, the world's not going to continue, right? So there are, by definition, in the work we do, different classes of service that need to be considered. And we would need to flag our cards so we know what the class of service is for that item. So there could be items that are in defect land that are affecting a drop dead date that may have to have that class of service associated, like it was a mandate for X date. So the different classes of service may cross boundaries.
What number of bands and classes of service do you envision?
Well, it wouldn't be,
appropriate?
I wouldn't view that as bans, I just view it as critical tickets, mandates that are either legal, came from GA, came from the chancellor, got to be done by the state. Most of the other work that is important, needed to get done, we've committed that we're going to get it done, but we haven't necessarily said it's going to be exactly on the state, so that's the third level. And then the fourth level is the stuff that we said is maybe we'd like to get it done sometime, so if you happen to have some cycles where it's not overwhelming higher priority work, you might do some more. So I see basically 4 levels. Make sense? Oh, I did it again. Yeah, that's basically what we just talked about. So what are the metrics? Got to measure things otherwise. And it's especially important here, right? Because we aren't being so firm on dates except for mandates. Right? So how do we show our sponsors, if you will, that we're being productive? So cycle time, which is the time from when an item gets into the work queue until it's out, marked as done by the Kanban team, at cycle time. Lead time is from the time somebody throws something into the backlog until it's done. Throughput, the number of items delivered per unit of time. And then work in process. Basically what that's saying is we should be keeping track on a daily or weekly basis or something. Okay, how many items do we have in process? And are we adhering? How much are we wandering around our establishment? And so we want to keep it pretty tight. So that's kind of a more of a team-focused metric, right? But the others are things that can demonstrate to the business that we are delivering, and as they see them improve, they're getting better service from the team. Anybody think of anything else?
Metrics-wise or questions?
Metrics wise.
So
Questions, if you have questions.
Well, I am curious in the metrics, is so these measurements are based on days, hours? Because I'm hoping that we're not going to be tracking times hourly.
No.
No, it's
It's
the last
really
day,
like-
right?
It would probably be business days.
I mean, it would be, if we decide weeks, but we just need to have some way of getting a sense of how we're doing.
I was hoping it wasn't also going to be adding that we're tracking the time.
No.
Well, actually, I was thinking minutes and seconds. Yes, that.
I've been a consultant, I have tracked my time in the past, but
Yeah, no.
Yeah, no, there's no
Days or
scenario
weeks.
under which, for any reason, we're talking about having people track their actual time.
And the way that you try to track that from different teams or different, is that ultimately you have to have some sort of consensus on what a unit is, like what a user story is. I mean, some of them are going to be bigger than others, right? So,
Right.
And
And so you do need,
value the hours that were assigned to them, or how are you totaling, I guess?
that those are, and so there needs to be oversight that's looking across all the teams that are working, and to the extent reasonable, try to keep their measures of things reasonably consistent. So there is more of an apples to apples comparison than it's totally, you can't compare. Because then that not only makes it hard for us, but it would confuse our sponsors. This team looks awful when really they're basically putting out the same amount of work. They just think as the story point's this big, where the other story looks that big.
I do have a question. At no point did we talk about the impact of vacation time as an example, or if a team member gets sick. How does that play into things? Because I think we would all like to take our vacation time feeling free and not be the blocker because we have got a planned vacation.
Vacation time has to be factored in. It would depend upon, like, if there's only one BA working on it, then Rich might have to say, somebody needs to fill in for Ann on this team while she's gone. You do some crossover talking and then somebody else fills in. Now that might create a little bit of a backlog because that person isn't as familiar with what you were doing as you were. And so when we see a backlog before analysis, well, we'll know immediately why. And when you get back, it'll gradually come back down. But absolutely, all those variables, somebody gets sick, impacts it. If they're out for a day, you just suck it up. If they're out for 3 weeks, that's a different.
Keep in mind that one thing is that, say you're assigned 50% to an HR team. So 50% is not 50% of 40 hours. 50% is got to adjust for the fact that you're going to have some sick and vacation time somewhere in there. So I would say the real number of hours we're saying 50% is not 20 a week. It's whatever. And we have to do the math. Done at the annual level, I have to do it at the weekly level.
Right, but if
let's say it's 15 hours a week is really 50%. I'll make up a number. That should over time account for sick and vacation. Now, you have a 2-week period you're going to be out in this 2-month period. That's certainly going to be a thing. You're lost. You're not going to be there. So that's when the person kind of managing the team, whether it's a PM or a functional lead or a manager, needs to just know we better not pull in any more stuff because Anne's not even here.
But I was looking at some of the stories might be only 2 days in total.
Right.
And you're on vacation when that was in line to be pulled. So then does that mean it's a resource?
Well, you're having these daily stand-ups, so optimally, it wouldn't get pulled in the second before you're going on vacation. Right.
The team was choosing what to pull to.
Exactly.
Pushed.
So you have this work queue that's, think of that as just, over here on the left, right? Bob showed it. And Rich says, okay, well, I know we got, people available. Let's bring the next thing to respect to look at the configuration. And then off it goes. Now he's not going to pull that in if you're the key person on the DA standpoint of that team and you're not here. Well, wait, he might pull something in that. We already know enough from this. This can go right to technical. We talk about pulling this in and assigning it to Kim to start coding. So we just need to make some decisions. That daily stand-up will help drive a lot of that, right? You're not there, we'll realize, oh yeah, that's right, she's on vacation. So I think a lot of judgment is applied. And I think we envision that you shouldn't need a PM for each of these once they become. I really think the functional leader is probably the best person to kind of share that stand-up call. And so, let's say let's say for Rich, Megan's not here to pick on. And so Rich is doing a stand-up. We're into this now. We know what we're doing. Next thing up, we'll pull the data mart changes off into the queue. And he pulls it in because he knows some of the great people here. But he might not pull an LM thing in if you're not around. You might wait on that.
But I think because we don't know necessarily, we're not estimating things out, and we all like to plan our vacations, all of a sudden where, in what you were kind of envisioning a flow to be, will definitely have to be very fluid.
Yeah, I think, keep in mind too, Bob mentioned, there's things that are mandated on us. We gotta have the data mart closed, we gotta do ACA and all those fun stuff that's very mandate driven. So those things might be the case Bob described where, you know what, Ann's gonna be out, no one is after her to change her vacation, it's not quite on schedule, so that's when we have to bring in another person. It could be I could have the same issue on the technical side, Kim's gonna be on vacation, she was coding, well, Jeremy's gonna have to take over the coding and get it done because we're on a deadline. Or we can wait a week or two because it's not a hard deadline, we might choose to wait and wait until we're back. Or it's cheaper. So,
On his own.
what are you talking about?
If you're pulling Jeremy in, you're pulling him
Just
off
an
the
example.
So you're looking for a free resource, potentially.
Well, they're,
Yeah, you'd be looking for a suitable backup that if it's on a deadline and that's the immovable object is the deadline and the person's not there, the first choice is not, don't take vacation. It's, we have a lot of talented people across our teams. They just step in and they finish the work. Whatever.
But I think the next point is you're pulling them from their
Something
current
else.
existing team.
right.
Or now they've
Well,
got more
yeah,
cards
Of
and
course.
they look like that backlog and they're.
It's,
And I think that just take a little while to get used to it. I think that's one of the reasons why you don't allocate 90% of the time to a team, to have some capacity that's somewhere, but we'll see how it,
Right.
we'll see how it plays out.
I would agree. I
Trying to
think
have
it'd be
some
smart
rotation.
to not have any one person more than 75% totally allocated to Agile teams.
Yeah, in an ideal world, I'd like to have redundancy on the team so that they're not going to come in cold.
Right.
Whether that's possible too, I don't.
Well, I'll give you an
know.
example. On our finance procurement pilot, we have 2 developers assigned to that pilot.
And how many functional,
2.
so you have.
So we have redundancy built in. Yep. That's why bigger teams actually make more sense.
Right.
And so we have built in
And if
redundancy.
you keep the whip down, that's easier to do. If you're doing
True.
If you're doing 80 things, then that gets much harder.
Right, that was part of his earlier presentation
Right.
is trying to keep it lowish so you can, if that board is all cluttered, you can't see what's in every column, we're doing something wrong. We've got how many columns? 5 or 6 columns, so 12 items across. We should be able to keep track of that. But I think all your questions are excellent. I think we're gonna have to kind of play through it. And the first time someone's gonna be on vacation when we got something in the queue, we just decide, does it wait? Do we have a backup? What's the right play? And that's gonna really be a Rich Megan decision in your guys' space. To do.
And just like prioritization is a decision that gets made in the moment based on what's going on in the business.
There's enough pressure to feel like taking vacation, you feel guilty. And we at HR want to promote the necessary vacations so that you come back refreshed and revived and going and be a productive team member
And
versus burnt out team member.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more. I mean, that's what I tell my staff is I don't want you to work when you're on vacation, you're on vacation. Don't take your laptop, don't look at your phone for emails, just get that out, come back when you're done. So we don't want this to make that harder to do. So I think all good questions.
any other questions?
Can we go over the members of this implementation team?
Okay.
I'm not really clear on.
Which one are you on?
I am on page 14.
And your question?
Who are these people?
Well,
So what is it? Yeah.
4 of the 5 are you.
Yeah, that's what I'm afraid
Oh,
of.
this is a team,
Right.
right? Not multiple teams. So
What's the PO?
PO would be if there was a product owner.
So we don't always have this members, do all these members?
There won't always be a PO.
How is the PO different from the customer?
The PO basically is the primary representative of the customer. But remember, the product owner he has customers or she has customers that he or she is trying to satisfy.
So in our world, is the product owner, like you mentioned, could be Shauna, or are we talking?
Could be, right.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
some red,
It could be
Shauna,
Sean, it could be the role that he plays sometimes as an interface between our side and their side, trying to manage that.
I think development is pretty self-explanatory. Analyst basically means the business analyst, right? AGPM, that's the Agile Project Manager, which, as Don just said, may not actually be a PM. It's somebody doing that role who can be Megan, or
It doesn't necessarily have to be.
could be one of the actual PMs, just will depend. The tech writer, obviously, we're talking about change management team. Test QA and analyst are usually in our world the same, right?
In some other worlds, it's different. There's
Right.
a QA.
The specialist focused QA team. And the customer is, of course, the customer.
So when the customer is sort of campus, which we often say our customer is campus, do we then designate somebody as a representative of that customer?
Sure, who's gonna sign off for your drive?
And sometimes it's internal to us.
Right, so whoever, I mean, at the end of the day, someone's gonna sign off on that going into production, that's a customer representative by default. So that's where you get into some of the people you mentioned, it's the Shawners of the world, it's the Vicky sometimes,
Sometimes it's the
it could be Rich.
Yeah,
Could be
so
really
like
big.
So like for the data mart, I wound up being the product owner because I'm the primary interface. But then part of the theory from an HR perspective is that Vicky and Link expect that the senior director over in areas like Adam, the positions, is representing what their campus needs to do for positions. So the campus winds up being the customer, but Adam may be the product owner as far as how position management stuff works.
But a E-part bug fix on a position isn't gonna be Adam. It's gonna be you.
Probably so. Until we get the,
Well, if we're looking, if we're having meetings every couple weeks, to talk about new priorities and stuff, it may make sense for you guys to try to pull it out.
right, because
Or you can be proxy.
yeah, sometimes we go to the business process subcommittee to say which things on the E are causing the most heartburn. So,
And I mean, you can even choose to share the list with them and say anything on the backlog that seems high priority to you all, and that's the input into our prioritization.
right, yeah, we do that.
You can adapt it, because you guys do a lot of research already.
And then if Fran wants us to do more things that we think are providing value to campus. And so there's going to have to be the mechanisms for saying, how do we make sure, and sometimes seeing it through the eyes of the central office is not the right way. So there'll be, I think, some adjustment on that going forward, but I don't think we have any magic bullets at the moment.
Is there anywhere in the Cambium cycle a retrospective, reflective kind of opportunity?
There's two ways to do that. One is the operations review is a bit of a retrospective. How are we doing as opposed to last month? It's a interactive kind of a. But the team should kind of on a regular basis take an hour, 2 hours, and sit down and say, okay, how are we doing? This is what our metrics are looking like. How do we feel we're flowing as a team? Is there something we can do differently?
And that would be facilitated by the project manager or the.
By the quote project
Agile
manager,
project.
right?
Especially early on, trying to see what's going well, what's not, what's the needs for people, what's maybe slowing us down. We want to have those discussions. We fully expect whatever we start with, it's not going to be in the future. We're adapting it or all. Trying to be consistent across all Connect. Now, I know we do, but we expect people to come in.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you for your time.
So I was going to ask you this before you said that. Have you ever heard of this It's in job. But it's turned on in SBT, it's not turned on in, I don't think I've ever seen it.
No.